Hi, everyone. Welcome to More Than Numbers Live, a data show focused on turning data teams from support functions into engines of growth. I'm Ollie Hughes. I'm one of the co-founders of Count.co. We're a canvas-based BI tool helping data teams move away from the dashboard factory and become their organization's problem solvers. Each week, we have a chance to interview someone in the data world who's helping people drive more value from data. And this week, we've got Tristan Burns. Tristan Burns is one of the world's leading data coaches, helping data leaders understand and improve the way they're driving their organization and their team towards value. He's worked with hundreds of data leaders at a time, and so we're going to work with him to understand exactly what are the challenges that are common for data leaders to be facing and how he can help us go about solving them. Tristan, hello. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Ollie. Thank you. What an introduction. It's great to be here.
I haven't oversold you. You and I have actually met from just both riffing on LinkedIn about the pains of being a data leader and the pains of the support function. So I've always wanted to get you on the podcast because I believe what you're doing, how you're tackling it, obviously count very much from a technology perspective, but obviously what you're doing, helping the people to engage with these problems is just a great mix. So thank you for being up for it.
My pleasure. Yeah, it's great to be here. And yeah, like I said, it's great to continue the conversation.
Absolutely. So my first question, I've prepared you for this, is my favorite icebreaker question, which is when you were in a practitioner, because you've worked in many big brand names in your time, what was the data tool that really took your heart, which really made you realize that data was the place, despite all its challenges, that actually data was the industry you want to be part of?
I don't think your listeners are probably going to hear this one too often. I know that when I said it to you the first time around, I think you fell off your chair with excitement. My answer is Domo.
Domo, exactly. Yes. I mean, Domo is one of those things where it has a very loyal fan base, but it's just never broken into the mainstream. It's like it's not in the typical place you'd go. I mean, so tell me why you love it. What is it that about it that really took your heart, that made you realize it? You didn't want to go the Tableau or the Power BI route. You wanted to go Domo and be like that black sheep of the data place. What was it?
Well, when I first encountered it, I'd never actually heard of it myself. Obviously, I was familiar with Power BI and I was familiar with Tableau. I'd used Tableau in the past. I know you kind of asked me what was my first, but I'm going to answer this, that Domo was my favorite rather than my first.
Yeah.
I probably get into this a little bit, but I'm allergic to Microsoft products. So I immediately, didn't want to go down that route. I worked at the time in a kind of a big organization, but it kind of had a very startup-y vibe. And I think that we wanted to use something that was cool and different and it followed the ethos of a startup. And we came across Domo and I just fell in love with the usability, the look and feel. It's very clean. It's very minimalist. It's kind of Scandi in that regard. And I just really like Domo. And compared to some of the other tools out there, I think it's just very nice.
There you go. I mean, if Domo, you want to give me some endorsement for recognizing a different BI tool, then here we go. Thankfully, I think it has a very loyal but very narrow use base. But it's cool. I'm actually, you know what? I've never even used it. I've never even seen it. It's one of those walled off products you can't even get your hands on unless you have an enormous budget. So there you go. If you have a lot of pockets, then maybe and you didn't think Count was the future, which clearly it is, then Domo's the place to go. It's grateful. Let's have a different answer. I love it. Well, look, I want to jump straight to it, Tristan. Like, you've worked with many data leaders. You have an amazing perspective on the challenges of being a data leader. There's so many. If you go on LinkedIn for more than about 10 minutes, you'll see someone talk about the challenges of being a data leader, the challenges of impact, talking about the average tenure of data leaders being really low. That's one of the most challenging positions to be in an organization. And you get that like full shotgun blast to the face every day when you're meeting people, helping people. Yeah. So I just want to start just talking to you about what you're seeing. Like, what are you hearing from data leaders that you're talking to, working with, coaching? What are the typical problems? Then let's go into some of the things that you'd help people think through how they can approach this, because I imagine people generally have very similar topics or very similar challenges. I don't know. You tell me.
They absolutely do. I tend to find myself having the same conversation over and over and over again. I think it helps that we talk about this online quite openly and it resonates with people and we attract people who have those problems and help them solve them. In terms of what specific problems I'm seeing over and over and over again, it's things like data teams feeling like they're just a service desk rather than something that contributes strategically to the organization. And in that regard then seen as a cost center rather than a value add. I don't think it's very nice to feel like you're, a liability on a balance sheet rather than an asset. And I think data teams can be assets, but data leaders need to find ways to make that work and to prove that they can provide value. And that's difficult for people who've never been trained to do that and don't have necessarily the skills to do that. Other things that I come across are kind of tangential to that, but not being included in strategic conversations. I think that data actually needs to come before strategy, and then also data needs to come after strategy in terms of being able to reflect on how that strategy is performing. How can an organization determine what its strategy is going to be for the next however many years without being properly informed by the data they've collected and have seen in the market and so forth in the first place? And if data individuals aren't, included in that conversation, then are we getting the right inputs into the strategies that we create for ourselves? So I think the data people need to make a case for being in strategic conversations. As another point, they're not currently typically, and that's a big problem that the people I speak to experience. They would like to be, and they feel that they should be. They're not. Yeah.
Those are amazingly. They are very existential questions, right? If you're not at the table helping drive a business strategy, they're self-reinforcing, aren't they? Like, either you're not at the table driving business strategy, helping form strategy, then you're only ever going to be seen as an input to someone else's strategy, and seen as that cost center. But they're kind of existential. Like, those are the topics which, if you, they are big problems, right? If you're seen as that way, and obviously this whole podcast is focused on the exact challenge of that. So I'm sure there's also other kind of more tactical ones we can dive into as well. But let's focus on these two, and I'd love to understand how you help a data leader like unpick that. How do about the tenets and how we talk about the operational way of working towards operational clarity, problem solving, time to decision. But that's quite, that's a operational thing. Where do you start when you're talking to someone about how they move out of being that support function? How do you coach someone that way?
Yeah, so I think it really starts off as a maturity concern for the organization. Data people data teams often start within an organization at the very, very bottom. They're brought in because someone needs a report. So we'll hire a junior data person. There's already a lack of strategic thinking around that. It's not, let's bring in a really super experienced senior data person who can help us think very globally about how we use our data. It's actually, no, let's just get some young junior person to come in and start reporting for us. So it's the wrong foot to start on to begin with. And a lot of organizations, even large ones, make that mistake. That person in that organization, or those people in that organization, are therefore they don't have the authority, they don't have the leverage to make a case for being strategic, and they just become reporting functions usually and service desks. So I have a question about data, I'm going to send it to those guys. Guys, you've got 15 minutes to come back to me with a response, kind of thing. And this treadmill stuff. And it's very, very, very difficult for them to get out of that dynamic. The way that I kind of coach people to approach that is you need strong leadership. You need someone who can, at some point in time, just say, okay, pause. We need to really reflect on, is this process working? Is it adding value to the organization? Is our data team as contributing as well as we know that they can be? Are the right procedures in place, the right processes in place to limit their exposure to kind of ad hoc, low value work? Can we actually put a cap on that and then help them or get them to work on more longer term vision, strategic type stuff? So that would be the first. Yeah, just assessing the situation and putting some limitations in place. It is a difficult conversation to have, and a lot of people hate having it.
It's quite hard to sort of own up to the fact. Like we obviously we both know the problem really well. We're trying to solve it in two different ways, in many ways. And I did a piece of work recently where I asked data teams how much of their team's time do they think actually drives business impact, and it was about 10%. They literally sheepishly admitted that only about 10% of their time as a data team is spent like moving the business forward, and then 90% of their time is spent just maintaining the envelope of performance, maintaining reporting, or maintaining questions that keep the business sort of ticking over. And that's kind of a shocking thing to own up to and go to the business and say, this isn't working, and I genuinely am a support function. That's not where I want to be. That's quite a big, because the risk is they say, oh, you're right, yeah, we should get rid of you. So you've got to go in there,
unless they
actually.
unless they can take what you've just said and make a business case for why they ought to be seen as a more value add proposition, then I would probably say, what's the point? Why do we have data teams if all they do is ask questions that those people who are asking them could probably find out for themselves anyway, if they bothered to?
That's why I do this podcast. It's why I believe in the tenets, that the 4 pillars of value. Because if you don't give the business an answer which is more appealing or at least exciting, then you are just a thing which they can just automate away. That you are ultimately a middleman to the raw answers that the business has to hold, and you need a data team which actually can drive clarity, solve problems for the business. Otherwise, you're just in the way of the business doing that instead.
Exactly. And what you're talking about there, I believe, is a business case and a strategic vision for the data team at the organization. If data people can't understand how that organization makes money, what that organization's strategy is, then it can't clearly make a case for no longer being a service desk. How can it add value to the organization unless it's very clear on what that looks like and where the effort needs to be applied and what the ROI potentially is as well?
Yeah, you know what? One of the things that I really believe as an industry we've got to solve is there is a really poor definition of what a data team's role should be. Again, it's something I think I would love to help be part of this, help that solution. Because if you're like a VP of product or VP of marketing, like the business, what you think your role is and how you add value is probably pretty similar to what the CEO thinks your job should be, or the CTO thinks your job should be, and where marketing fits into the organizational responsibility. For data, everyone has a different opinion what a data team's role should be. And that is true as different data leaders, as I keep hearing. It's definitely true for the different CEOs, different CTOs about how they view data. Some have had experiences of a data team very high functioning, literally driving forwards on the biggest initiatives of the business and being like intrinsically part of the solution. Others have seen it just as you say, like that service desk model. Yep. And if you've only experienced service desk model, then your expectations are exactly that. So we've got to have a more exciting narrative, which we can just teach the rest of the world to understand.
That's a very interesting point. Actually, you talked about the other departments or divisions within an organization. You've got things like finance, marketing, operations, sales, and so forth. Those are traditional business functions that have had a seat on the board for forever, that have come up through the modernization of business since Second War or whatever. Data isn't. Data is new on the block, so to speak. We don't feel that new. We've been around 20, 30 years, but we still haven't carved out an identity for ourselves in the same regard that those functions have. In fact, we've let others determine what that is largely. And another contributing point to that dynamic is that largely people in the data profession start their careers as individual contributors, not business people. And that's necessary when you're early on in your data career, because you do need to be able to analyze data, you do need to be able to work with systems. But as you go up in your career, that is no longer helpful to you, and you actually need to be much more business minded. Whereas someone who's come up in finance or someone who's come up in marketing throughout their entire career, from day one, they've been business centric, right?
Yeah.
We have to learn that skill on the go, and no one's teaching us.
I agree. And you know what? I love what you're saying there. It's a good point to remember that you're right. Data is a kind of a new function. So there is a kind of maturity curve attached to that, a kind of like a decade-long maturity curve of like, what is data for, which we're all learning a bit and getting. So that's a helpful kind of, it just makes us feel a bit calmer that actually is a problem that probably will get better over time. That's a helpful reframe. And then you're right about the domain expertise. We actually just interviewed Thibaut, who is leading analytics and data at Deezer, and he has come from, he didn't come from data. He came from M&A, came from strategy, and took over the data function. And so just was like off the bat, exactly how to use his data or resources and his team to drive value. And if you haven't done that pivot from business to data, which is difficult in other ways, right? Different problems there. But if you go the other way around, then you're right. You've got to learn that quickly, and probably no one's really going to tell you because they assume it instead of assuming they need to help. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
What is there? So that is, there's a lot to unpick there, and I love the idea of like building that business case for that vision. Those of you who are following the podcast, you should go back and look at other interviews and look at the tenants in more depth, because there's a lot that I hope you can help. And Tristan's got is very helpfully shared us with a resource about how to deal with maturity curves and your organization, which he's going to put into the show notes. There's more to dig into that existential question. Tristan, maybe you can dive into some more of the kind of, well, I say fun in the wrong way, but like some of the smaller but very painful examples of where you get problems which are a bit more tactical. I think one of the ones that I think about is like the idea of like shadow data teams, which I think is quite common. Like people desperate to get data, and then suddenly just out of blue, marketing has formed a data team, and it's like a rival. How do you like? They're things which are, they sound funny when I say it, and they're a bit less existential, high level. They're much more tactical. Like, do you see those kind of things? Is that a thing which you have to?
Yes.
How do you help people with that kind of situation?
Shadow data teams is a very common problem. Well, let's be careful with the language that we use, because it's not always necessarily a bad thing. It can be an indicator of something, but it is largely bad. So shadow data teams that pop up within the organization, and that typically the data leader, who is, let's say, the central data leader in most cases, isn't aware of. So you might say, for example, a marketing team has gone and hired an analyst, the HR team has gone and hired an analyst. And you ask yourself, well, why do these teams feel like they need this additional support? Are they not getting that support centrally from the data teams? Typically, they are not. That could be down to the data team taking a bit of ownership and saying no to certain requests, and saying, look, we don't have capacity, or we've got more strategic, important stuff to be focusing on. And if you are doing those things, and those teams, which I feel are the right things that data leaders should be focusing on, and those teams therefore feel they're not getting the support, and they go and hire their own person, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right?
Sure.
Where it can get dangerous is where data governance and definitions and consistency throughout how data is looked at in the organization starts to fall apart, when there's not a very constructive relationship between a centralized data function and a shadow data team, for example. There's also a lot of ego bruising that can happen when someone goes and hires their own analyst, and the data leader doesn't feel like they were consulted on this, because that's their domain, and you've gone and hired someone with the expertise that they would usually be looking after or managing. So that's always a scary thing for them to come to terms with. I love that reframe. That is actually an indication of a positive sign of people wanting data, wanting to use data, and it's the governance, it's the connectedness that you need to have between those embedded teams and the central team. It's actually something we picked up on with Philip from Monzo, and we talked about the analogies between finance and data, that you could have like a financial controller working in a different part of the business, but if they're working to different terminology to the central finance team, you've got to have a whole host of problems at a very kind of fundamental level. It's your finance team. The same principle applies to data. Just you've got to have that connected dot to empower and move people forwards. Yeah. If you are the data leader in this scenario, and you do come to know that there are shadow data teams popping up, I would do my best to bring them under the umbrella in terms of defining measurement and KPI definitions, because it's going to blow up in your face if that person sits in a meeting and says, actually, my numbers are different to yours. Let's go with that person's numbers, because that's never what you never want to be having that scenario. So you want to gain control, or at least consistency across that challenge. You also want to be making sure that you guys aren't taking on the same pieces of work and doing and duplicating effort on something. If there's projects that can be delineated between the two functions that and in a way that makes sense, then most certainly this is still a positive thing. I'm not anti. I'm anti the shadow piece rather than the piece that
exactly. It's the shadow rather than the. I mean, the discussion about centralized versus embedded data teams is going to never end. It's going to be a question as old as
either way.
The shadow piece, isn't it? It's the fact that it's not as you're missing win-wins by having people working under the same kind of consistency. I think that's a great way to put it. I love that. I love that framing. I mean, one of the things that makes me think about, as you mentioned, the things like anxiety and bruising of ego, is how much of your coaching is data specific and how much of it is just sensible management coaching and actually not to do down your expertise, but like actually a lot of this is actually true for any manager and any function. Like, I think that's quite a helpful thing for data leaders to hear is actually they aren't that unique, or actually maybe they are. How do you riff on that? How does that come across in the way you work?
Certainly. So I touched on it earlier where I talked about people who come into data typically coming from an IC background and moving up through the ranks. People who become managers and leaders of teams and so forth are thrust into a entirely new environment where they're now expected to not only be a data expert, probably also contribute somewhat as an individual contributor, but they're also now a stakeholder manager, they're a people manager, they're doing a whole bunch of different things that they probably aren't particularly well skilled in. So to answer your question, where do I mainly focus? It's probably to a pretty large extent agnostic of actual data, and it looks more like management, but it is specific to the problems and challenges that are very much central part of the experience of data leaders. Because they don't have it. They've not really had to fight these battles in the past.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. There's definitely as we were describing, like the fact that as an industry we have a bit of a identity to work through generally, what it is to be a great data leader, which I think we're solving. That just layers another level of complexity, and there's another layer of the coaching that you need to bring, or how to help them influence. That makes a lot of sense. That's really cool. I appreciate this. Is great. Is there anything which you always try and land with a data leader when you coach? If you had a 1 minute to speak to any data leader, can I ask you what you'd say? Like, is it that generic you can talk about, or is there anything that you think our audience should definitely hear from you?
One thing that bothers me every time I speak to someone new is I ask them, what's your organization's strategy? And they can't tell me. And whether or not that's because they're not aware, or because that organization has not clearly articulated it, or even that organization doesn't actually have one. But in any case, it's concerning to me, the sheer volume of people who can't articulate an organizational strategy. So my question is then, how can you lead a data function without that knowledge?
That is one of the best pieces of advice I think I've heard on this podcast. Like, that is
really
damning. I mean, just think how much of the time that, if you don't know that, how difficult it would be to make a business case, how difficult it would be to justify any of the work you're doing if you don't know where your business is going.
Right?
It sounds like reactionary. That's crazy. Yeah, great.
I use the example right now. A lot of organizations, I guess, with economic times and macroeconomic environment, profitability is a strategic pillar that is a common one right now for a lot of organizations. Post-COVID in the last few years, it's been growth, and it's been growth at all costs. People have gone into debt, they've raised money and equity and invested heavily in growth, but now money isn't so easy to come by. Interest rates are higher and so forth. So now profitability is a key strategic pillar for many organizations. So then when I hear that the company wants to focus on being profitable, and I ask the data leader, well, what are you doing to help the organization be more profitable? They're like, well, what could I do? Or what can I possibly be? Well, what do you mean? Like, we're doing our piece over here. And I'm like, well, the organization has said profitability is really important. So why haven't you recalibrated what it is that you're working on to focus on helping deliver that strategic pillar?
And the response, just to clarify those listening, the response is not, I'm going to go save compute costs and I'm going to go get a cheaper BI tool, by the way, in case you had because that is just leading you to the service desk support, and then it'll just keep chipping away. There's always more cost to take out. You've got to drive value. I completely agree. That you've got to lean in and work out where to drive the value, not just drive down the cost. Yeah.
And we have the data to find the answer to those questions. So let's use it.
Exactly. Yeah. Love it. Well, if those people, this is kind of a self-reinforcing thing. If you're listening to this podcast, you care about driving value, and therefore we're speaking to the converted in some respects. It's just been great. The last thing I want to ask you, Tristan, just a general pulse question, if I can, is just on the AI topic, a thing which I talk about because it's in topical and people are thinking about it. But like, from your perspective, I see two sides. I see people being very anxious. I also see people very excited. Where do you find the people you're coaching landing with AI? Do you have a sense of pulse on that? Because it is, you can see it as an existential question generally people are wrestling with. Have you got a sense of where people are, like as a kind of population of data leaders?
Yeah, I think in the short term, there's some excitement, and in the long term, there's some anxiety. So, what's going to happen in the long term? What's going to happen to our careers? Where does data play a role going forward in the future? Where does AI place pressure on our careers? It's not necessarily. You will have heard this before if you're reading up, reading at LinkedIn or reading articles about AI. That it's not necessarily going to be that AI will replace the entire job that you have, but it will replace components of it or find ways for you to be more efficient in those areas. So
Yeah,
what does that
yeah.
look like? Where does that apply pressure? In the short term, I think there's excitement. I think a lot of people are happy to get their hands on projects. And one cool thing that I think is really important that a lot of people are using this opportunity to do is to bundle together AI projects with like data governance projects, which have been long ignored. So when the CEO, whomever, comes down and says, hey, let's do some AI projects, here's a bit of budget, you say, fantastic. Part one is data governance, because we need to be in a position to at least, data will never be perfect, but at least do the thing that we've always put off doing in terms of data quality.
Yeah, just driving simplification and clarity just generally, and using AI as the buzzword to get there.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
But also, I do, with a word of caution, don't blow the opportunity to learn and upskill on AI and just
Sure.
by focusing on data governance and quality. You want to get, you want a horse in the race.
Fair. Time is running away from us. This has been a great conversation. I want to ask you two more things. One is just like, what's the piece of advice you give to anyone getting into data? Like, what would you say? You've been on a path with the biggest companies and the smallest. Now you're coaching data leaders. What would be the piece of advice for someone starting their career in data that you think we should learn at the start?
I would say personally, I would avoid corporates. I worked for some of the biggest companies in the world, like you said, early on in my career. When you are a data person in a big company, you are a very, very small cog in a very, very, very large machine. It's great for getting the reps under your belt. It's great for doing the same thing over and over and over again until you're really, really, really good at it. It's not great for understanding the broader picture, understanding what that business does, who its stakeholders and customers are. All those things that I think are really important if you want to be a strategic data leader down the line. So
that makes sense.
Startups, small businesses, get close to the founders, be in the room with those people if you can.
It just require you. Yes, I get you. You're saying you can't. The bigger the company, the smaller the cog you become, and the more specialist you become, and the less you get that breadth, which is going to help you later on to actually understand and be that kind of business acumen that you need exposure to succeed. That's cool. I love that.
I think it just speeds it up.
Yeah, exactly. It speeds it up. Actually, it is the fuel that drives value from the data in the first place. I've got my other question I'm going to ask you is our anonymous data leaders question. This is the letter from the community about people who I told them I was speaking to you. This is what people were asking. I've got a letter here for you to tackle. This one is, what's Tristan's take on the curse of the CDO, I think the Chief Data Officer? There used to be a period of time when companies were adding Chief Data Officers onto their board. It felt like this never really took off. Does Tristan have any idea what this could be because of? So there you go. Maybe that's a failed CDO or someone who's taking the title. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I'm not a CDO myself, not been one. So it's the best guess from what I've observed and the conversations that I've had with people. But my interpretation of the challenge is that, again, we are seen as a technical function rather than a business function. So we're hiring people. If you look at any CDO job description out there right now, you're going to see a litany of technical skills and experience with such and such tool and blah, blah, blah. It's the wrong thing to be prioritizing. We need to be hiring those skills. If you have them, fantastic, but we need to be hiring business-centric, strategically minded individuals into these roles. When you hire technical people in, it's kind of like a hammer and a nail. When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you're technical, everything looks like a technical problem. Upstream from technical solutions needs to be data culture and data strategy. If those CDOs or those people can't, first of all, address those things and improve those things, any technology they build is the wrong thing to have done. So I think there's an ROI issue that comes heavily with CDOs. They don't stick around and they don't succeed and they get let go because they've not proved the value of data and the value of their solutions because they've not integrated them with strategic thinking at the forefront.
I agree. I think that's a really good summary. It links back to what we were saying before about maturity of data just generally. that the roles of CTO, CMO, CEO have been around for decades more than the idea of data being core to your business. And it feels like if you don't know, there's not an industry-wide or a very, very clear purpose for data to be strategically understood and valued by an organization, but I guess more generally in the industry, then you've just got a role without purpose, which doesn't sound like it's going to be a successful one. So I think that's why when the big data rush came, people put them on the board because they knew it was important, but they didn't really get what that role should be other than data needed to be covered. I'm sure there'll be a chief AI officer in the next decade, which have a similar problem because people don't really understand what that means.
Sooner than that, I think in the next year or so, we're going to see that, a lot of that.
That's a hot prediction right there.
Yeah.
That's great. Tristan, thank you so much. This has been a really great conversation. I thank you so much for sharing with people the challenges that I'm sure they feel a lot of affinity to in the audience, and some of the way to think about tackling it. It's been a real joy. If you want to follow up with Tristan, he's shared two things to mention. He runs an amazing book club for data leaders, which I recommend getting signed up to. And of course, he shared kind of a white paper document about how to think about data strategy. Both of those things are in the show notes. Head to count.co/MTN. If you want to learn more about Count, about how we help data teams drive impact from the BI technology perspective, head to count.co as well. We obviously the technical solution to Tristan's coaching solution. Together, we're a great combo. Tristan, thank you so much for being here. I'm grateful. I hope you have enjoyed the conversation, and thank you all for checking us out and enjoying the conversation.
Thank you for having me, Ollie. It was an absolute pleasure to be here. I really, really enjoyed the chat.